They say Mother's Day is about love and appreciation. Breakfast in bed, hugs from grandchildren, a card with shaky handwriting that reads, "You're the best, Grandma." That's what the commercials promise anyway. But that Sunday morning, my daughter Angela handed me a rose and an eviction notice. She smiled, tight-lipped, polite, rehearsed. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom," she said, placing the flower on the kitchen table. Her husband Mark stood behind her with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. I looked down at the envelope she'd just slid beside the rose. My hands trembled before I even opened it. Inside, a typed letter. Cold, efficient, final. They had given me 30 days to leave the house. My house. The one I bought with 40 years of nursing shifts and sleepless nights. The one where I raised Angela after her father died too young. The one I gave her title to, naively, out of trust and love, when she said it would make things easier for the family. I remember staring at the rose, soft, red, and fresh from the store. The scent of betrayal is always stronger when wrapped in perfume. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat in silence for a long time. But what they didn't know, what they never even thought to ask, was that I had signed one last paper they never read. And you won't believe what I did after walking out with nothing but that rose. My name is Edith Mayfield. I'm 78 years old, and for the past 12 years I've lived in the guest room of the house I bought myself. Once upon a time, a warm, bustling home, filled with laughter and late-night cookies. Now it's a place where I tiptoe past closed doors and whisper in my own kitchen. I moved in with Angela, my only child, after my husband passed. Heart attack. Sudden. He collapsed while planting petunias in the front yard. By the time I ran out with a cold towel and shaking hands, he was already gone. Just like that. 46 years of marriage. Gone in a blink. Angela insisted I shouldn't be alone. She and Mark had just moved into a new neighborhood in Spokane. Quiet streets, tree-lined sidewalks, friendly neighbors who waved when they mowed the lawn. They had 2 children by then. Ava was 6, Jacob just 4. I remember the first time I stepped into their house. Angela had painted the hallway a soft yellow, just like the one in her childhood home. She said it made her think of me. "You'll be comfortable here, Mom," she promised. "You'll always have your place." At first it felt right. I helped with the kids while Angela returned to her teaching job. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, read bedtime stories. It wasn't always easy. My knees ached, my back protested. But I felt needed. I felt part of something. I sold our old family home 2 years after my husband died. The upkeep was too much for me alone, and I didn't want it to fall apart like so many other things had. With the proceeds, I paid off some lingering medical bills and then used the rest to help Angela and Mark buy a larger house. They found a 4-bedroom colonial with a basement and a garden in the back. "Perfect for the kids and for you," they said. To make the mortgage process easier, Mark suggested putting the title under their names. "It's just a technicality," he said. "We'll make sure everything is squared away legally. You'll still live with us, of course." And I believed them. Why wouldn't I? There was even a paper involved, a life estate agreement, that a lawyer friend of my late husband recommended. I didn't fully understand all the legal terms, but he assured me it would protect my right to live there until I passed. I tucked the document away in a small wooden box with my wedding ring, insurance papers, and an old Polaroid of Angela as a toddler eating blueberries on the porch. In those early years, the house felt full of life. The kids used to burst into my room every morning asking for waffles. Angela would call me her rock. We had music playing most afternoons, Frank Sinatra, Doris Day, sometimes even Taylor Swift when Ava took over the Bluetooth speaker. I would hum along while stirring spaghetti, Angela laughing from the dining room. "Mom, your cooking beats any takeout." But slowly, things shifted. Mark started working longer hours, and when he was home, his greetings became more forced. He stopped calling me Mom and reverted to Edith. I shrugged it off at first, blaming stress, but then came the offhand comments. "Wouldn't it be easier for you to have your own space?" My buddy's mom moved to Rosewood Assisted Living. Really nice place. The basement's a bit cramped for the kids now that they're getting older. Angela didn't object. She just smiled, distant, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. When I tried to ask her if everything was okay, she'd say, "You worry too much, Mom. Everything's fine." But her tone was clipped, her hugs shorter. She stopped coming to sit with me after dinner, stopped asking for advice about her students. Even the children changed. Ava became a teenager, her earbuds a permanent fixture. Jacob rarely looked up from his iPad. I started to feel like a ghost in a house I helped build, and yet I stayed. Out of love, out of hope, because mothers don't just give up. There was a moment, about a year before everything unraveled, when Mark brought up renovations. He wanted to turn the basement into a separate unit. A guest suite, he called it. But he was already listing it on a rental website the day after construction began. Angela assured me it was temporary. "It's just until we pay off some credit cards," she said. Still, it changed the rhythm of the house. The family dinners stopped. The kitchen became off limits during quiet hours for the tenants. I was asked to limit my presence when guests came over. At one point, Mark suggested I enter through the garage door instead of the front. "It's more convenient," he claimed. I nodded politely, but I felt it in my bones. The shift, the subtle erasure. Angela didn't look me in the eye much anymore. She was always busy. School reports, PTA meetings, soccer practice. When I offered to help, she'd say, "It's okay, Mom, just rest." But it wasn't kindness. It was distance, carefully veiled as concern. I still made breakfast every Sunday. Pancakes, bacon, fresh coffee. It was my tradition. Even when no one joined me, I set the table for 5. I placed the syrup just where Jacob liked it and left a folded napkin by Angela's favorite chair. Maybe I was stubborn, or maybe I just needed to remember what home used to feel like. Then came that Sunday, Mother's Day. I woke early, as always. The birds were already singing through the open window, the sky a pale pink. I put on my floral apron, frayed at the edges but still soft, and started whisking eggs in the big mixing bowl I'd had since Angela was little. I even made cinnamon rolls. Angela used to beg for them every Mother's Day when she was a child, even though the day was meant for me. I'd always laugh and make them anyway, because that's what mothers do. We give. The house was quiet as I worked. The smell of baking dough filled the air. I set the table with the nice china, laid out silverware, folded the napkins into little roses, just as Angela had once shown me when she was 11 and obsessed with hotel manners. When I finally heard footsteps, I smiled instinctively. I turned, expecting a sleepy, Happy Mother's Day or a hug from Ava. Instead, Angela walked into the kitchen fully dressed, holding a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper. Mark was behind her again, arms folded, jaw tight. Ava and Jacob trailed behind, but neither said a word. Jacob didn't even look up from his phone. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom," Angela said softly, placing the bundle on the table beside the plate I had set for her. I unwrapped it carefully, a single long-stemmed rose, red, perfect, silent. Then she handed me the envelope. My hands trembled before I even touched it. I opened it slowly, hoping, praying. It was some misunderstanding, a thank you card, a note of gratitude, anything but what it really was. Inside was a typed notice. Effective immediately. We request that you vacate the premises within 30 days from receipt of this letter. I remember reading it twice, then again. The words seemed unreal, detached, like reading instructions for assembling a piece of furniture. Except this wasn't a bookshelf. It was my life being dismantled. I looked up at Angela. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Mark cleared his throat but said nothing. The children stared at their screens. No one moved. No one flinched. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt the room tilt, as if I'd suddenly stood on uneven ground. I reached for the edge of the table to steady myself. Angela, I finally managed. She took a small step back. We've talked about this, Mom. You need more care than we can provide. It's time. Time? For what? For abandoning the woman who raised her? For discarding me like I was furniture no longer useful? I didn't respond. I couldn't. My chest tightened, not just from shock, but from something deeper, a rupture in the soul, the kind that doesn't bleed but leaves bruises all the same. I turned away and went upstairs, every step heavier than the last. I closed the door to my room gently, not slamming it, not crying, just quietly. The walls were lined with memories, faded photographs of Angela as a little girl, a framed cross-stitch my husband made for our 30th anniversary, and a shelf of old books with my name scribbled inside the covers. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the rose still in my hand. There was a time when Angela used to run into this room in the middle of the night after a bad dream. She'd crawl under the covers and wrap her tiny arms around my neck, whispering, "Don't ever leave me, Mama." Now she was the one asking me to leave. I glanced at the suitcase in the corner, always packed, though I never thought I'd use it. Inside were a few essentials, my medications, a change of clothes, a small photo album. I'd kept it ready ever since the first time Mark made a comment about space and moving forward. Maybe I knew deep down that this day would come, that the warmth of obligation doesn't always translate into love. For the rest of that morning, I stayed in my room. I could hear laughter downstairs, clinking glasses, Angela's voice light and performative, as if she hadn't just dismantled the last thread tying us together. I wondered if the guests knew, if they even asked where I was. Around noon, I opened my window for some air. The sun was high, bright and indifferent. A breeze carried the scent of lilacs from the backyard, flowers I'd planted myself when we moved in. I had named each row after the grandkids, hoping they'd tend to them someday. But no one came upstairs. No one knocked. That afternoon, I made tea. I set it down next to the rose on my nightstand and watched the petals begin to curl. Even beauty has its expiration date, I thought. I didn't sleep that night. I lay still, hands folded over my stomach, staring at the ceiling. I thought about my mother, how she'd once told me, sometimes dignity is the only thing they can't take unless you give it to them. I thought about the document I had signed all those years ago, the life estate agreement, a quiet clause in a noisy world. They had forgotten it, or maybe they never read it at all. In the morning, I packed my things. Just one bag, no fanfare, no dramatics. Angela was in the kitchen with Mark, whispering about a new contractor. I walked past them without a word. Ava and Jacob were on the couch, faces glowing with screen light, oblivious. I paused for a moment, waiting, hoping, for one of them to look up. No one did. I reached the front door. I stopped, turned around. Angela finally looked at me. "Where are you going?" she asked, startled, as if my leaving were some grand inconvenience. I held up the rose. I'm leaving, like you asked, I said. Happy Mother's Day. And then I walked out of the house I paid for, out of the life I built, out of the family I thought I still had, but not out of the fight. Not yet. I spent that first night on Lorraine's sofa, my coat still on, purse clutched, like it held more than just aspirin and tissues. Lorraine didn't ask many questions. She never had to. We'd worked side by side in the same hospital for nearly 30 years. We knew each other's silences. She made me a cup of chamomile tea the same way she always had. 2 sugars, no lemon. As I sipped it slowly, she sat across from me, her eyes kind and searching. They told you to leave? She asked softly. I nodded. My throat was still too tight for words. She reached over and placed her hand on mine. You're not sleeping on a couch more than one night, Edith. I've got a guest room, and more importantly, I've got sense, something your daughter clearly misplaced. I wanted to defend Angela, even then, but the words wouldn't come. All I could think about was the look on her face, calculated, composed, distant. The same face I'd once watched fall apart over a scraped knee. That night, I lay in Lorraine's spare room staring at the ceiling fan spin in slow circles. I thought about the first day I moved into Angela's house. She had been 32, newly married, and still calling me every night for cooking advice. I remembered standing at the threshold of that home, Angela clutching my arm, a nervous smile on her lips. Mom, you being here makes everything feel safe, she'd said. 12 years later, she'd handed me a rose and a legal letter. My mind turned over the years like pages of an old photo album. The time I stayed up all night sewing Ava's Halloween costume. The way Jacob used to fall asleep on my chest, warm and heavy like a blanket of love. I had given so much of myself to that house, to that family, believing it was where I'd grow old and, eventually, die in peace. Instead, I had been sent away like unwanted clutter. In the morning, Lorraine made oatmeal and insisted I eat. Then she handed me a thick manila folder. You're going to want to look through this, she said. Inside were documents, copies of letters, property tax statements, and at the bottom, a faded photocopy of the life estate agreement I had signed over a decade ago. My name was clearly listed, along with the clause, the grantor, Edith Mayfield, shall retain the right to reside at the property located at 414 Briarwood Lane until her death or voluntary departure. This agreement is binding and overrides any subsequent ownership attempts to remove said grantor from residence. My heart thudded as I reread the lines. How did you get this? I asked. You gave me a copy 12 years ago, remember? The day after you signed it. You said, just in case they forget, Lorraine. Well, they forgot. Didn't. I stared at the paper in my hands. The legal language, once meaningless, now felt like armor. Lorraine leaned forward. They tried to evict you from a house you legally have the right to stay in until your last breath. That's elder abuse, Edith. That's a crime. I felt something stir in my chest. Not anger. Not quite yet. Just a quiet, defiant clarity. For months, maybe years, I had swallowed hurt with grace. But now, for the first time, I felt the weight of my own dignity rising to the surface. I don't want revenge, I whispered. No, Lorraine said, but you deserve respect, and they're not going to hand it to you. You'll have to claim it. The next day, Lorraine drove me to her lawyer, a sharp silver-haired woman named Judith Lawson. She listened without interruption as I explained what had happened. At the end, she gave a small clipped nod and said, You have every legal right to return to that house, and if they try to stop you, we can make it very, very uncomfortable for them. It wasn't just about the property. It was about principle, about reminding Angela and myself that age did not erase value, that kindness, when mistaken for weakness, had its limits. Judith drafted a formal letter of notice, citing the life estate agreement and warning of pending legal action if interference continued. She also advised me to attend the upcoming renovation party Angela had posted about on social media, a little soiree to celebrate the changes they were planning to make to their home. "They're flaunting what they think is a victory," Judith said. "It's only fair you bring the truth to the party." At first, the idea felt absurd. Me showing up at a party I hadn't been invited to, dressed like some character from a courtroom drama. But as the days passed, my doubt gave way to resolve. I went through my suitcase and pulled out a lavender dress, one of the few I had managed to keep with me. It had been my late husband's favorite. He used to say I looked like springtime when I wore it. Lorraine helped press it. She even lent me her pearl earrings. "Don't go there to shout," she said, as she placed them in my palm. "Go there to stand tall." So I did. The day of the party, I arrived just as guests were pulling up. I could see the balloons tied to the mailbox, the "New Chapter Begins" banner strung across the porch. I stood at the edge of the walkway for a moment, steadying myself. The familiar ache in my knees flared, but I ignored it. My heels clicked softly against the pavement as I walked toward the front door. I rang the bell once. Angela answered, laughing, holding a tray of cupcakes. Her face froze the moment she saw me. "Mom?" "Good afternoon," I said, stepping inside. "Lovely weather for a celebration, isn't it?" She blinked rapidly, visibly flustered. "You weren't, we didn't expect—" "I know," I said, removing my coat. "But you'll want to see this." I pulled a neatly folded document from my handbag. Judith had ensured it was printed on thick, official letterhead. I handed it to Angela with calm precision. She glanced at the first line, her face drained of color. Her hands trembled slightly as she read on. "What is this?" Mark asked, approaching from across the room, 2 wine glasses in hand. "A reminder," I said, turning to him, "that I may be old, but I'm not legally invisible." Mark took the letter and scanned it quickly, his jaw clenched. "This can't be—" "It can," I interrupted, "and it is. I have the legal right to live in this house. You tried to evict me in violation of a binding agreement. That's a felony in this state." The room had gone quiet. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Guests holding plates of hors d'oeuvres now stood frozen, eyes darting between us. Angela attempted to smile, but it collapsed halfway. "Mom, we didn't know. We thought—" "You didn't read," I said flatly. "You assumed, and then you acted, on Mother's Day." I reached into my bag and placed a second document on the table. An official notice from Judith's office stating that legal action for elder abuse and unlawful eviction had been initiated. Angela stepped back as if the paper had burned her fingers. "I never meant to hurt you," she said weakly. "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "You just didn't care enough not to." Silence stretched. Then slowly people began to leave. One by one, they offered polite nods or averted gazes as they passed me in the hallway. The laughter and clinking glasses faded. Angela stood in the center of her quiet house, decorations sagging behind her, a half-finished cupcake melting in her hand. I turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to let the silence settle around them like dust. My eyes scanned the room one last time. The walls I had once painted, the couch where I used to cradle Ava after her naps, the kitchen where Angela learned to stir batter with her tiny hands wrapped around mine. "I don't want your apology, yo say nai wan," I said, voice calm but unyielding. I want your understanding. There's a difference. Angela's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. Mark stared at the floor. I walked to the coat rack and retrieved the same floral shawl I'd worn for years. Lorraine had mended its fraying edge just the night before. I slipped it over my shoulders and took a steady breath. Behind me, Ava finally looked up from her phone. Her expression wasn't defiance. It was confusion. Maybe, for the first time, she saw her grandmother not as a fixture of the house, but as a person. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice quiet. I smiled at her gently. "Somewhere I'm respected." And with that, I left. Not with bitterness, not with regret, with dignity. As I stepped out into the sunlight, Lorraine was waiting in her car at the curb. I got in, closed the door, and let the weight of the past fall off my shoulders like the last petal of a rose. "I take it went well?" she asked, eyes twinkling. I didn't need to answer. The driveway behind me was still, the music silenced, the party forgotten. In its place stood a house that no longer felt like home, just a building full of echoes. But in my hands I still carried something solid, proof that I was not powerless, that I had roots far deeper than the walls they tried to push me from. That night, as I sat with Lorraine in her quiet living room, sipping tea under the soft hum of a ceiling fan, I realized something. The climax wasn't about confrontation. It was about choosing to stand. And I had. 3 weeks after the party, Angela and Mark stood in front of a county judge, heads bowed, voices subdued. I sat on the opposite bench, flanked by Lorraine and Judith, the life estate agreement resting neatly between us. The courtroom was quiet, sterile. But justice, as I would come to learn, doesn't need to shout. The judge read from the documents, line by line, confirming my right to reside at 414 Briarwood Lane until my death or voluntary departure. Then came the ruling on the violation of that agreement. Angela and Mark's attempt to evict me had not only breached legal terms, it constituted a violation of state protections for elder residents. They were each fined and placed under mandatory compliance review for attempted displacement of a dependent senior. Angela looked over once, her eyes rimmed red. But I didn't look away. I didn't need her remorse. When the judge dismissed the court, Angela approached me outside. Her steps were hesitant, her hands clasped in front of her like a child caught in a lie. "Mom," she began, "I'm sorry, truly. I thought I was doing what was best, for everyone." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply met her eyes and said, "I raised you to be kind, not calculative. I'm still here, but something in me is gone." She flinched as if I'd struck her. But truth is like that. It hurts, especially when it's overdue. In the following days, I was given access to my living space once more. But something had shifted. Even with the legal victory, the house no longer felt like mine. The walls remembered the silence more than the laughter. The garden I once tended had gone dry. My room, untouched since I left, smelled of absence. I stayed one more night. Just one. I looked out the window into the backyard, at the lilacs I once planted, and made my decision. The next morning, I returned to Judith's office and signed a transfer. I donated my life estate to a nonprofit that helps abused elders find refuge and legal aid. They would use my story to protect others like me. I left the keys on the kitchen counter. No note, just closure. Lorraine welcomed me back, not just with open arms, but with an idea. "You and I," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We've got more than enough tea sets and stories between us. What do you say we share them?" I smiled. "A tea room for women like us?" "Exactly. A place where no one is invisible." It took a few months, some modest savings, and a generous grant from the same nonprofit I had donated my estate rights to. But Lorraine and I opened our tea room in the heart of an old brick building on Main Street. We called it the Violet Table, named after the flower that, despite its delicacy, returns year after year with quiet strength. The walls were painted a warm cream, lined with photographs of women, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, who had stories to tell. Some came alone, some came in pairs, but all came looking for something: community, comfort, a cup of chamomile strong enough to chase away a hard week. We held afternoon readings, knitting circles, memory-sharing sessions. Women brought in recipes from childhood, journals they hadn't opened in decades, heirlooms passed down in silence. It became a sanctuary, a place where age wasn't something to hide or apologize for. It was the badge that earned you your seat at the table. Lorraine handled the books. I brewed the tea. Some afternoons, I'd sit by the front window and watch the town pass by, grandchildren skipping ahead of their parents, couples bickering sweetly over grocery lists, a world still turning, still growing. Angela wrote to me once, just once, after the court hearing. The letter was long, filled with attempts to explain, promises to make things right, and lines underlined twice like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. I read it only once, then folded it neatly and slid it between the pages of my recipe book. Not out of spite, out of peace. I had no room left in my heart for war. I didn't need more apologies. I had reclaimed what mattered, my self-worth. I never returned to the house on Briarwood Lane. I passed by it once, on a quiet morning drive. The curtains were different, the garden wilder, but the porch light was still the same, the one my husband had installed the year Ava was born. Funny how little things remain even when everything else changes. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. One evening, as Lorraine and I closed up shop, we stood by the front counter, the air still scented with lavender and lemon zest from the last pot of tea. She looked at me and asked, "Do you ever regret not staying and fighting longer?" I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "They gave me a rose on Mother's Day," I said, "but I chose to bloom elsewhere, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the place that broke you and build something better, somewhere else, with someone who sees you, hears you, and values you not for what you can do, but for who you've always been." I've learned that growing old isn't defeat. Sometimes it's when we learn to finally stand tall. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, for bearing witness. This story isn't just about betrayal or legal documents or a house on Briarwood Lane. It's about something far quieter and far more enduring: dignity, the quiet courage it takes to say, "This is not how my story ends." I spent most of my life giving, as a mother, a wife, a nurse. I poured myself into people I loved, often without being asked, and even more often without being thanked. That's what many of us do, isn't it? We build, we hold others up, and sometimes we disappear in the process. But I've learned something now, something I wish I'd understood sooner. Your voice doesn't get quieter just because you grow older. Your boundaries don't become less important just because your hands tremble. And your love doesn't have to be blind to be deep. I still love Angela, and I pray she grows from this. But I no longer carry the burden of fixing everything that's broken. That's not my work anymore. These days, I pour tea, I listen, I laugh more often than I cry, and I sit beside women who remind me that even bruised hearts can bloom again. So if you're watching this and wondering whether you matter, whether it's too late to speak, to walk away, to begin again, let me tell you, you're never too old to stand tall. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is leave the room with your head held high.